Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Sarah Kernion, and just in the few moments that we've had before we have logged on here, we've been having a great conversation. And welcome, Sarah. Thank you for being here. And tell us a little bit about who you are, and then we can kind of get into whatever it is we want to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm Sarah Kernion. I am a neurodiversity advocate and keynote speaker. I have, as I like to say, three beautiful and healthy children, and two of them have non-speaking autism. No, they are not twins. They are 2.5 years apart. My two youngest children, Millie and Mac. And through their lives and their diagnoses, I believe my life has grown expansively through learning about cognitive diversity and circuitry, and how not only is neurodiversity a competitive advantage for companies that embrace employees with cognitive diversity and dissonance, but that the trajectory and the development of children with neurodiversity is one to be celebrated and one to be held separately from a neurotypical development, because I do believe that every parent's job is to lead any child to become the best version of who they're meant to be. And through being their mother, it's freed me to do the same for myself. And so I've really welcomed and celebrated this wild and crazy curveball of a life I've been handed, and saying yes to all the possibilities in being their mother has been the greatest gift.
And how old are your children?
So I have a neurotypical 11.5-year-old daughter named Morgan, 11 and a half, almost 12, going on 19, maybe 40 at this point.
Yeah, I understand.
And I mean, her eyes are stuck in the back of her head from those eye rolls as a tween to her mother. And then Millie is 9.5, and Mac is almost 7. So each of them are 2.5 years apart. And I was pregnant with my son Mac when Millie was starting to exhibit developmental delays.
I have so many questions. Obviously, I have questions because I've known people who are neurodiverse as children, and and sought to have relationships with them. I'm thinking of one young man who's now in his 20s, but I first met him when he was 8,
Mm.
and he had this um, imaginary world that he lived in, and these imaginary characters that he would talk to,
Mm. Mhm.
and and it was sophisticated. It was extraordinarily sophisticated,
Mhm.
and now he had difficulty writing with his hands. He had difficulty with his hands, but he could type, and he could do that sort of thing. So and I encourage him to create these stories and put them on, put them down on paper somehow, or tell the story and, record the story,
Mhm.
because this is his story. It's not a fantasy story. It's his story. It's the story of his life that he's living.
Mhm. Yes. Well, I applaud you as someone who is a parent of neurodiverse children, that one of the things I ask for from when communities or companies or leaders say, how can we best support the neurodiverse children in our lives? And I always say, join them in their world.
Hmm.
Try to join them and celebrate and recognize. And it's going to take a little bit longer and probably a little more of an acute um, space to be held for observing them.
Yeah.
I believe that when you do seek to understand them and join them in their environment of what makes them feel good, or as they're stimming and happy and joyful, there is a recognizing of an adult figure in their life going, oh, they're trying to understand me. And they might not be able to say it, but I believe that there's a connective feeling that you feel. And I see that through the practitioners, the therapists, the family members of mine who do that with my two, who actively seek to understand and support those small skills or things that, like as you said, with the young man in your life, that you encourage them to continue to grow in that capacity. And that only helps the greater community, whether that community is your small family or your town or your street, those little, I'll get into this hopefully with you. I've coined the term inch stones because milestones are such a thing amongst the typical community of parents and educators. And I really believe that in the development of a neurodiverse child, when you're not hitting milestones when the child's not hitting milestones as a parent, you feel a lot of shame and feeling of failure. And how am I failing my child? And with the children that are neurodiverse, it's the celebration of those smaller, what I call inch stones. And because those are just as powerful on the developmental scale for a neurodiverse child as a milestone. And in celebrating those smaller wins, I believe that only encourages the continued growth along a trajectory that is not typical. It's completely atypical. And that's okay. That's what I always say. And that's okay. Why, if we're seeing a child who's not going to develop along that curve, you're setting yourself emotionally up for sadness, grief, a pullback to what should have or what could have or what the expectations are. And I think when you rid yourself of presumptions, assumptions, and statements about your child, you free them to become the best version of who they are because you are giving them the celebration of their development. It's theirs and theirs alone. Yeah.
In the past month, I've had a lot of conversation and a lot of instances where neurodiversity came up in some way.
Mm.
And as I looked at all this and absorbed it, I mean, it was about 2 weeks ago, 2.5, 3 weeks ago, that I realized that I'm neurodiverse.
Mm. Oh, wow.
Here I am 71 and I'm just figuring this out. And when I realized it, it answered a lot of questions and it was very liberating. And in my sense that I've never been able to fit into any group. I may be included, but I don't fit. That makes sense, right? And it's because of the way I think and the way I respond and the way I see things. I see things that other people don't see. So the way my brain operates is not typical. It's
Right.
very atypical. And I never thought about it in some kind of clinical way. I just
Right.
thought of, I'm just a person who doesn't deal with details very well. I'm a big picture guy, and that was
Right.
kind of it. And I like talking to people, and that was kind of the sum total of kind of the way I perceive myself. And then I began to see these things, and people begin to say, I guess I'm really neurodiverse, and
Mm-hmm.
that means something that's significant to recognize. So I
Thank you for sharing that. That's huge.
yeah,
That's really powerful.
I haven't said that to many people. I mean, I think the message there is it doesn't matter what age you are, you can discover who you truly are.
Absolutely. There is no greater luxury in life than the gift of discovering who we
Mm-hmm.
all are.
Mm-hmm.
And leaning into that, the process of it the journey of that discovery has a satisfying nature to it that no person, no external person, place, or thing can do, such
Hmm.
as that exact internal validation. That's awesome, Ed. I received an ADHD diagnosis only 3 years ago, and notoriously young girls are underdiagnosed with neurodiversity because it exhibits so differently behaviorally from a young age. And specifically with the executive function um, behaviors seen as like you say, like big picture, I was always able to take in like the totality of things, but the
Yeah.
detail parts are always so difficult to manage from a habitual standpoint. And in having a daughter and a son with neurodiversity, I'm seeing from the ground up, even in obviously there's autism and apraxia. However, the differences of two children, a male and a female, that I get to raise that have these diagnoses is so wildly, like, it's fascinating to me because they are, while the diagnoses and labels are the same, the way in which they are developing as a male and a female with those diagnoses is so wildly different.
Mm.
So wildly different. And I talk often with Mark about this. I feel like I have this dissertation in me, like what is gender, sex, sibling order, and what is autism? Because my daughter Millie is the middle child, and she is so typically the middle child, Ed. Like she is so typical in her middle childness sometimes. And my son, who is the only boy and the baby, oh, he knows it. He knows it. He knows he's mama's little piece of gold. And I wonder how the autism is just a one part of the description of who they are.
Hmm.
And yet it does give uh it provides understanding for how they live and their behaviors for sure, but it's just one part of them. And I think as I see and watch them interact with the world, I get to facilitate all the parts of them, the sensory seeking, activity based boyness of my son, and this very smart march on desire to learn of my daughter, of both of my daughters, but of Millie as well. I mean, she just, girl, boy, from the baseline educational standpoint, girls tend to develop a little quicker on the educational
Hmm.
timeline. And that you would think autism would kind of negate any of those typical developments from a gender and sex standpoint. I see it typically with them. So it's just the complexity of it is fascinating to me. And to your point, like the introspection that you were able to have and diagnosing yourself and feeling like, wow, that's me. I hope that you feel so proud of yourself and so freed in that.
It's a revelation.
Yes.
It explains so many things,
Right?
and
Yeah.
I mean, and it follows. Um, I mean, this is supposed to be about you, but obviously this is about both of us now.
Yeah.
It follows from a year and a half, year and 3 quarters ago when um, a coach in Switzerland reached out to me, had been reading my stuff, and her name is Barbara Cleve, and she said, I think you're a polymath. I said, what? And the more she explained that to me, I said,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So here in my 70th my 70th decade, I've discovered that I'm a polymath and a neurodiverse person, and now it all makes sense. The pattern of my life was exploration and discovery and
Mhm.
adventure and constant change and never staying put. And that remains to this day. And that's how mine is manifested, and where my polymathy is not manifested in this intense analytical look at the world and in studying things and having a grasp of all this detail. It's in actually studying people and knowing how to talk to people. And
I have to ask a question because I recently stumbled upon something that said a lot of adults with neurodiversity that get diagnosed or self-diagnosed later in life realize that they're craving for understanding human relationships and connection. And I've always desired one-on-one conversation like this. I find it fascinating. I love learning about humans, is actually from a standpoint of this unconscious, subconscious knowing that you're not typical. And we have this unconscious, subconscious drive to try to figure out these typical humans around us. And so it's an exploration, it's an exploratory desire, but it's also we don't even realize what we don't realize is that we know on some level that that 7 out of 10 others are not like us.
well,
And we crave to understand.
the question I have is, are all these people truly typical?
There you go too, right?
I mean, this is, I don't know, I think I've done close to 170 interviews for this podcast, and no one is typical.
Yeah,
Everyone is unique. Everyone has something to contribute.
totally.
So,
The
so it's, I think this is one of those, how do I go into this? Let me back up and ask this. If you look at this stuff, if you look at neurodiversity and you look at autism and you'll see that there's a lot written about the cause of it, the source of it being founded in pharmaceuticals and particularly vaccines that were given to children, and that the incidence of autism has increased significantly over the last 2 generations. Now, I'm not asking you to be a critic or an advocate for one side or another. I just think that that's part of the context we're in, and it doesn't really serve the child or the adult who is dealing with this. But that's part of the context, and I'm curious how you provide a kind of a buffer for your children in that kind of environment.
Well, there's probably threefold answer. I didn't know where I stood on that discussion until I had children with autism.
Mm-hmm.
I also didn't realize the totality of the medical community's guidance to autism and the development of children. But what's really risen on my heart and in my mind and in conversations like this is I believe that we're just more aware and we're seeking to understand more. I deeply feel I've taken out the controversial, polarizing vaccination conversation from my own standpoint and feel like we are just, I think, beautifully seeking to understand children who have maybe in the past not been given the chance to be understood.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think to your point about the number of guests that you've had on and the number of interactions that you've had and our own late diagnoses of neurodivergency, how many children that I grew up with in the 90s, that were considered or generalized in classrooms that were severely autistic or with special needs. There were probably 5 or 6 more of us in that classroom, which would elevate that percentage. So right now it's 1 in 36 diagnosed. Well, there's a lot more women in their late 30s and early 40s like myself who are proactively seeking understanding of their child because society talks about it more. My own personal lived experience was that my son, because I was so informed of my daughter's autism, by the time I had my son. Um, I'm divorced from my children's father, but I acutely remember saying to my ex-husband when our son was um, about 11 weeks old, I said, he's autistic as well. And I knew it because I had studied my daughter so intensely that I was recognizing these micro stims that my son was exhibiting while nursing.
Mhm.
And I was noticing how there was a lack of there was a lack of physical connection that was not developing as quick as my typical oldest. So I basically had experience with both kinds of development from this, fourth trimester, newborn phase. So my own thoughts on this is that if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism, and what diagnoses that child with autism, I believe comes from a much more genetic root than vaccines. But I do believe that that anything that we take and put into our body can turn on or off light switches within the circuitry of
Yeah,
ourselves.
yeah, that's very.
There was a lot of discovery post both children's diagnoses about genetic history from both my ex-husband's side of the family and my own that would give rise to an understanding of Millie and Max diagnoses and my own as well, my own ADHD diagnoses, and speaking with family members more gave a lot more of an explanation on it. So mine is more rooted in genetics. I do believe that the pharmaceutical industry and vaccines can turn on circuitry differently. And I believe in the gut brain behavior, the gut brain connection as well. I really do believe in that.
I agree with all of that. I agree with all of that. And the thought that, as I've thought about this over the last few weeks, and thinking about the people I grew up with, I'm wondering if the way we talk about people as being extroverted and introverted is not also a function of this neurodiversity, particularly people who are introverted who may not desire to be very actively engaged with people.
Mhm. Smaller social groups, one-on-one, intense connections, intensity of chosen hobbies and activities. I agree. And sometimes, because I do have family members that assign themselves as more just labeling introversion. And I do believe that if that makes that person feel like that's enough for them and they don't need to seek understanding, like going farther into understanding what that introversion actually may be, that's on their own individual. But I think you're spot on with that, extrovert, introvert, um, the Myers-Briggs scale of personalities. I mean, shouldn't there be a Z axis for neurocomplexity?
That would be interesting to add into that.
You
Um,
know, how often do you seek big groups out for conversation? I personally have always, I mean, my friends since growing up will say a group of 6 women that I've known since I was 7, we get together every year. That is about my max capacity
yeah.
of a group.
Hmm.
And I believe that I'm able to enjoy a 6-party week-long, trip because I've known them since I was 7. And there's an understanding there. I'm not sure would choose to do that with people I didn't know. I would do if 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 a mentor or a family member that was an older female that I hadn't gotten to know said, "Do you want to do a 2-day trip with me and go hiking in an Appalachian Trail?" I'd say, "Oh, one-on-one? Like, yeah, let's learn more about each other." But if that was a group of 6, no, hard pass.
Yeah. I've known people that mirror what you just described, and
Mhm.
it is interesting. And they'll say, I like just a few. I like what just a few friends. I don't like a crowd. you know, and I like both. I mean, that's part of my neurodiversity is, if I'm going to go to an event, I'm going to be the first one there and I'm going to be the last to leave because I'm going to
Yeah.
meet and talk with as many people as I can.
In one-on-one, like, so this is also, then you dissect that. I'm
Yeah.
the same way, but I will still seek out one-on-one conversations in a massive conference setting.
Yeah. But I also enjoy standing up in front and
Yeah.
speaking. And, and I realize that I'm going through a massive developmental change in my life um, just over the last few years. And I don't have an explanation why this has kicked in. Recently, I spoke to a local Chamber of Commerce group, about 130 people, and I hadn't given a presentation in over 4 years. So this is my first time standing up in front of people, and I'm I'm a retired minister, so standing up in churches, that's a different thing.
Right.
It's a crowd that you don't know these people, and so I arrive at the event early, and the first person I meet, I realize that I have brought the wrong presentation. And so, okay, I know what I'm going to talk about. And I talked about what I do with the podcast, which is exactly how you came into relationship with me through Mark McGrath. And the phrase is, who do you know that you think I should know, and would you introduce us? And that was what I talked. I said, you all need to be marketing through your relationships and doing introductions of people. Because when you're making an introduction to someone else of someone that you know, you're putting your credibility on the line when you do that. But it's your credibility that tells that other person, oh, I want to know this person.
That's right. That's right.
And so I gave this presentation, this 20-minute presentation. And that's what I talked about. And I kept saying that phrase, who do you know? Do you think I should know? Would you introduce us? Over and over again. And 3 weeks later, I'm still hearing people talk about that. And that's never happened before. So I don't know what's going on. I'm glad for it, but it's not causing anxiety. It's just causing, oh, this is a really curious thing.
Well, the wave of impact you could never have predicted.
That's right. But the impact is there.
It's there. And I mean, that's so profound, I think, in our own human experience, is that we can't throw a dart and land on the target and say, yep, that's what's going to resonate with my audiences. That's what's going to resonate with, for me, with other special needs parents. That's what's going to resonate to a group of individuals that I don't know and are all strangers to me. That's like, I mean, how electrifying is that's just who you are. You were just sharing what has benefited you and makes Ed feel the most Ed. And you just kept sharing that.
Well, it's not the first time that something like that happened. When my daughter was mid-teens, it's when Hurricane Katrina came through and devastated the New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and I got involved in the recovery effort. And my daughter was invited to be in a group of other teenagers who were doing things to do this. They, social entrepreneur kind of things. And so there was a group of us that went down and spent 4 or 5 days on the Gulf Coast visiting places for our kids to see what was going on and how their efforts to alleviate problems there were being received. There was a mother and a daughter that came, and the mother was deaf. And so recognizing that the communication between this group of people who didn't know each other was going to be difficult at best, I brought a little whiteboard and markers so that we could communicate with her. And it made all the difference because it turned her sense of being on the outside into something where she was really on the inside.
That, again, and it's such a small thing. You probably didn't realize the impact of a whiteboard and a dry race, Penn.
Oh, I did know what it was going to mean
Yeah,
because I'd seen stuff like this before.
right.
I think when you're neurodiverse, you also become very sensitive to other people's situation.
Highly empathetic.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I know that you are a scholar and learner of John Boyd and
Hmm.
the Robert Coram and the biography. That when I read the biography of John Boyd, the first thing that popped out to me was that he's a special needs parent.
Hmm.
First couple chapters, and his one child that had, I believe, polio. He constructed some of the apparatus so that his child could be more included on the playground. And in his writings of the strategic, um, what is the title of the book? The Strategic Battle of Question Mark and Question Mark.
Hmm.
For me, the interaction versus isolation
Hmm.
is so powerful, because what you exhibited was that you did, that woman and her daughter in a situation such as that are generally isolated from the group, and not because of anyone's preconceived notions or desire to do that. There's just an isolation that naturally occurs. And I think that any capacity of a group to lean in to interact, and specific, like for me as the mother, choosing to interact with the world and not isolate my children and I, only allows for a greater understanding.
Hmm.
And as John Boyd did, created, I mean, he physically created a support system for his child to engage and interact. I believe that it's my job as a mother to put me and my children in situations to elicit interaction with typical groups like you're describing. And I always say, especially when parents go, it's just so hard. Like, I don't want to leave the house. I don't want to get on a plane. It's going to cause so much disruption. It's this. And I always say, yeah, you're right. It is. It's going to be 30 times harder. I would travel to China with my oldest, right? Like, if someone said you have 12 hours, you got to find your way to Hong Kong with my 11 and a half year old, I'd be like, we're there in 8. It's not hard. And yet, if someone gave me the opportunity to travel with all 3 of my children to Hong Kong to participate in something, I still could do it.
Sure.
It doesn't take away from the ability to learn from interaction. And maybe that's a maybe what gives rise to that is deep vulnerability and lack of shame of who we all are. I think there's a lot of shame that comes with when you are a parent of a child with neurodiversity. There's you have to process the grief and realize that the acceptance of your child being just who they are and not who you desired or dreamed them to be is part of the ridding of the shame aspect. And it's very difficult to be so vulnerable. Like that woman, like you shared, that was deaf. I can imagine that she shares a parallel journey with myself, and how she knows going in, this is not going to be as easy for her as it is for the others. It's just not. And I think that if you don't give energy to the feeling of like, oh, it's always harder for me, it's always harder for me, that's a ammo dump of energy. I'd rather put that energy into doing and interacting. And the irony is that when you do, like I'm sure this woman did with you, it is so enriching to have those experiences. You realize the goodness in those in our community. You realize the goodness in the world. You get to show how beautiful a different life is. I have more flight attendants that are on my bag of supporters now because of how much I travel with my younger two, because they go, oh my gosh, thank you. That was really helpful that you shared that. Like now I know if there's an autistic child on another flight, that's so helpful to know. Thank you so much. I wasn't there to teach anyone. I was just there to, live with my children.
Yeah.
I don't go out in the world thinking I'm going to teach, I'm going to show them, it's not that at all. It's just interacting. Um, and just being okay with that, it's going to be harder.
Well, I feel like jumping in the car and driving to your house and hanging out with your son and daughter.
Well, they are oh they are really, really amazing little kids. I mean, watching
You
them
know,
develop is the greatest
because
joy.
I want to learn how to communicate where you can't. Well, you take away one of those skill sets, which is verbal,
Yeah.
but they're still communicating.
No.
And
No, I mean they do have devices. There's technology that's now coming quicker and quicker and developing faster and emerging. But that's a language in of itself, right? That's a whole other subject. My daughter has taken to a device for speaking quicker than my son has, which goes back to what I was talking about earlier and the design, like sort of the learning process. But that if that's not provided, there is still such an ability for connection. I mean, I'm telling you, if you walked in my door after school today, my daughter, who just loves books, loves being read to, she would recognize that a new person is in the home. And I always joke that she'd be like, "Ooh, my next victim." She would run right up to you and go with her little book, which means read to me.
yeah,
And she will pop down in your lap, and you will have read Pete the Cat 20 times. And she will find satisfaction every time that you read it to her. And so quick, so there's a desire, these little kids who are autistic, the thought that they are not seeking social interaction is so false in connectivity.
right.
I believe the emotional capacity of them is actually, and empathy is even greater than a typical individual. My son loves Daniel Tiger, which again, for me as a child of the 80s and 90s and Mr. Rogers and PBS, Mr. Rogers is the precursor to Daniel Tiger as the cartoon. And so the lessons learned in Daniel Tiger, I'm like, I need to listen to these. These are, when you feel so mad that you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4, you know. And my son will watch these episodes, and you watch him watching it, and his bottom lip will start to quiver when someone's being left out. And he'll look over at me going, and he's not to say anything, like, and the tears start to well in his eyes, like, do you see how hard that is for that little friend of Daniel's? And I'll respond verbally and saying, I see it. I know. Oh, it's so hard when Miss Elena doesn't get included on the playground, isn't it? And he'll babble back, and I go, oh, I know. But I think Daniel's going to go reach out to her, and he'll start jumping on the couch and jumping up and down. And there is connection there.
Yeah.
It's just you have to be willing to pay attention and be more present. But isn't that what, the Eckhart Tolles of the world, and I'm sure your ministry in the past too speaks to? We get to be here. We get to be present.
Well, I think we're at it's almost a cliche to say, well, we're at a transition point in human history, but we're at a transition point in the modern world, because if you look back over the last 200 years, the society was organized to serve industry. Schools were set up to train people to go into industry,
Right.
and that model still is pretty much in place, because
Mhm.
it worked for better or for worse. It didn't work for everyone,
Mhm.
but it worked for those that became very useful in business in particular.
Right.
But I think that there is a growing sense that that model doesn't work anymore,
Right.
and a model built around experience is a better way of learning. It's a more holistic, it's more embodied. These sort of things are now emerging, and there's a science to this, but there's also a sort of a practicality to that's emerging, which is really, really cool. And so kids like your kids will fit much better into an environment where there's experience learning rather than kind of
Yes.
analytical rote learning.
I think holistic parenting, holistic childhood development, you're absolutely right. It's taking the parameters that which are already set up in society and using what we can to lean into the experiential nature of a wholehearted child and a wholehearted development of a human. And, you know, the communities and tribes are still always going to be there. And I think utilizing them to experience this world is you're absolutely right. It's like the modern turning point that we're at. Because I do believe that, not every special needs mom is going to be like me and sharing this journey. And that's okay. We need the ones that are going to be delving deep into the educational law side and legal system as well for what these children, how they deserve to experience this world. And it's going to take all of those things, like you said, to create and be open to, the whole experience of living. And I guess I always back it's not easy, but it's worth it. It's
Yeah.
always worth it. It always is.
We, our family lived in West Virginia when my oldest went off to first grade. And he was reading at the age of 5. And,
Wow.
well, we're a family of readers. And so he learned to read. And and by the time he was in 4th grade, he was reading adult level history books. So
Wow. Hmm.
so he was very motivated to learn. And he was, I mean, this is not a critique. It's just an observation. He was in a classroom and here he is reading, and he had kids in class that didn't know shapes and colors.
Hmm.
And so this disparity meant
Yeah.
that the school had to focus on the ones that were the least prepared. And so we ended up removing him from the school and homeschooling him.
Yep.
We ended up
Absolutely.
homeschooling all 3 of ours until they turned 16 when they went to the community college and spent 2 years there.
Yeah.
And when I realized when my oldest was about 10 or 12 was that a lot of parenting is is about making the parents feel good about their parenting,
Right.
and so they're in a sense they're doing things to compensate for what they feel like is lacking. There are all kinds of problems that
Absolutely.
arose in that. And what I realized was I need to separate myself from my children in a certain sense as soon as possible. So I started treating them as adults, as young as I could.
Yep.
And when they would ask a question, I wouldn't answer them. I would instead, I would enter into a conversation with them. I'd
Right.
ask them questions because I wanted them to make their own decisions. And
Mhm.
if you do my 3 children, they're not a little bit younger than you, um, but they're all very independent, very self-assured, very clear about what they want, and they're very motivated to be their best selves in the world. And so and what that meant though is that we're now really close as
Yes.
father to my children.
You and my parents would get along very well. And my parents, very similar aspect of parenting. And it's probably not until I had my own children that I realized the benefits of those choices in their parenting.
Yeah.
The I'll give an example. I'm the oldest of my 3 siblings. I have a sister 4 years younger, and then a brother 7 years younger than me. My brother, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My dad was an AP physics teacher for 30 years at my high school, and my mom is an artist and calligrapher, entrepreneur. And my brother, of the 3 of us, was very, very highly cerebral and intelligent, and it was very noticed very early on. And he graduated valedictorian of my massive public high school and went to Harvard as a philosophy major. And the amount of critique from naysayers just around the community that I grew up in, and
Mm-hmm.
not a lot, but a lot of people going to my parents, "You're going to pay for a Harvard education in philosophy? What's he going to do with that?"
Live.
And yeah. And my parents always said, Jackson is so happy in learning about theologies and religions of the world and philosophers. Why wouldn't we support Jackson becoming the best version of Jackson? And I don't think my brother would care that I share this. He met his wife in undergrad, and they live in California now. And my brother now works for Anthropic, one of the AI companies, as a in their tech department, and is on the cutting edge of what, the world and the chat GPTs and Claude, right?
Mhm.
And there were probably people for 15 years going, what's he going to do with that? What's he going to do with that? Well, Jackson and his wife are doing fine. She's a professor at Stanford in the philosophy department, and he works for Anthropic. It gives an understanding to that trajectory that you speak to as a parent, that they trusted that their children, if they become aware of who they are and supported, and they had in their parents just a fan of them becoming who they're meant to be, they will then come back. I mean, my siblings and I have all still have wonderful relationships with my parents, and we're very independent. My parents don't live in town. They're not daily a part of my life, but they are people that I seek to, ask for mentorship and love as I become, solidly in my middle life. And that is a gift. Yeah, I want to get this correct. I have it written down on my phone. I guess I'm paraphrasing. It's a parent's job is to not be a martyr and save their child from anything. A parent's job is to model what it's like to save yourself
Uh-huh.
and to constantly choose
Yeah.
the way in which that as yourself is to become the best version of yourself and model that to your children so that they in turn save themselves too.
The way I have come to describe it is that my relationship with my children is that we're mutual mentors of one another,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
they tell me when I'm off. You know, they're very willing to be critical of my choices,
Oh, yes.
and I'm grateful for that because if you're a conversationalist, you learn how to you can talk anyone into anything, and no one
Mhm.
ever can beat you in a debate because
Right.
you're always prepared. But my children can, and so I depend upon them for that purpose.
Yeah.
I look forward to sharing.
Yeah.
They're gonna enjoy this.
Yeah, you should, I mean, the conversation sometimes between my siblings and I and my parents got back from Japan on a trip, and we were like, how was it? Did you guys love it? And my dad's like, the food, we thought it'd be a lot more, rice based, he had this whole thought about what the food was gonna be like. And he's like, it was just so, and I go, Japanese? Like it was just, and my siblings and I were laughing. We're like, we knew you didn't love it as much as you did. You try to say that you loved it, you didn't love it because they like Americanized Asian food and Japanese food. But we were laughing. But being able to have those um, points to be with your parents, that like it's safe to have conversations like that.
Safe is a good.
Um, yeah, it's very safe, and there's humor found in all of it. I mean, uh, and I think the coming back, I think, the coming back of children to their parents in middle life is something that you have to start from the beginning, and you never know. You're not going to get that the I guess the ROI until later on in life.
Before we went on the air, you were telling me about the process of going and becoming a public speaker, and I'd like to hear you speak to that because maybe there are people out there that would like to have you come speak about the things that we've talked about today, which I think would be fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that as you shared about your own journey, there's things that rise to the top that you never think. I would never have thought in a million years that keynote speaker would have been added to my, list of like life CV. I had always been a writer. When I had my first child, I lived in Manhattan for about 10 years after college, and I had my first child in New York City. And that was in 2012, end of 2012, 2013. Instagram and blogging was very popular amongst the mothering parenting community. So I jumped in the ring. I did a lot of mommy blogging and really shared openly about my postpartum anxiety that I had, and led me to realizing that I lean in very vulnerably about my lived experience. And I find it therapeutic. I find that sharing hard chapters it frees others to feel like it's okay to have deep bumps and hurdles in parenting and in your development of self. I shared about postpartum and how I kind of worked through that and leaned into therapy and group work. And it taught me a lot about my own self, even though it was really difficult becoming a mother for the first time, and what rose to the top of my own self while taking care of my first child. As I wrote more and more and moved out to the suburbs of New Jersey, I just continued to do that on the side. I was a parent of three in 2017, 2018. My daughter Millie's diagnoses came down the pipeline. I began sharing more about that on the periphery, not a lot because I didn't have a diagnosis of Millie, and I was just entrenched within early intervention and also having a newborn son and a 5-year-old in Montessori school. I was going, all these backyards summer parties, the COVID get-togethers where everyone sort of social distance and was outside. I was speaking with a woman at a 40th birthday in the summer of 2021. And she worked at LinkedIn headquarters in New York City and had a friend in New York who was struggling with her daughter, a diagnosis of autism. And I began doing sort of one-on-one parenting, peer-to-peer support and calling, and anyone that knew me and saw what my work on just writing about my journey started to reach out in a capacity of, Sarah is a knowledgeable parent in this and can really help guide you. Talked to this woman, talked to a lot of different people, became sort of a community leader amongst special needs parents, and more on a digital side. And in January of 2023, this woman that I met at this backyard COVID birthday party reached back out and said, I need a speaker for Autism Awareness Month. In April, will you come and speak at LinkedIn to our employee resource groups? And I thought, I don't speak, I write. I'm a writer. I like to share my story and help. I love helping other moms through this process, but I'm not sure my story is worth like sharing. And I said, I could probably think of some other women that do this. And she said, nope, I'll see you in April. It's going to be April 11th. And she wouldn't take no. And she was just, at this point, just up and down, but I had a lot of respect for her and her own life and her own live story. And she said, I really think you can do this. I'd like for you to do this. So I did. I said yes. And I shared with others. And that month, I was April of 2023. So just over 18 months ago.
Yeah.
I did 3 talks in April 2023. I gave a talk at LinkedIn headquarters in New York. I spoke at the Bank of America Training Academy, and I spoke at a fashion company called Love Shack Fancy. And after that month, I thought, I love this.
Mm-hmm.
I love this. To your point about, I never thought the stage was for me. I just enjoyed sharing my journey.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, a friend who was an old mommy blogger, a friend of mine in private consulting work, had just completed her training at Heroic Public Speaking. And she nominated me to go. And so I went to the 2-day event, which is free, but it's nomination based. And that was the trajectory. So that was last May. And I delved deep into that 2-day workshop and came home feeling like, okay, this is the next path. This feels so right. This feels so much an evolution of what I am meant to do and what I get to do from what life has handed me, that it was like, all right, game on. Let's do this. So the last year has really been a growth of speaking specifically to a lot of employee resource groups. And I spoke a few weeks ago to the mothers, the Michelin mamas, Michelin headquarters in South Carolina. I spoke to their group of moms, and I'm speaking in a few hours, a virtual employee resource group called the Abilities Group at Turner Construction. They're one of the major construction companies based out of New York City. So I'm finding that the smaller groups and major corporations have a lot of employees seeking to feel validated in their parenting. And whether they're a typical parent or not, there's a great desire to learn about neurodiversity now, especially within other parents, whether you're a parent of neurodivergent children or not. And what has profoundly risen to the top, which I've been sharing with others profusely, is that Gen Z, I never gave Gen Z, I don't prepare my speeches to talk to Gen Z. I feel like I'm preparing to talk to parents around my same age, maybe slightly younger millennials or Gen X. Gen Z has risen and they are asking the most powerful questions in these fireside chats. I am blown away by their desire to learn. Their emotional intelligence and their inquisitive nature has given me, I mean, honestly, Ed, it gives me chills. It gives me chills. I have these 20-something-year-old junior analysts at companies come on these talks and fireside chats asking, I have a nephew on the spectrum who's 6. My sister has a child. We don't live close, but I see him at Thanksgiving. How can I, when I go to Thanksgiving, how do I help? What can I do? What can I bring? How do I, and I'm just blown away. I mean, it brings me such joy to think that I'm talking to parents and trying to validate their experiences and inspire them to lean into their life in greater capacity. And I'm actually giving skills to a younger population to engage with children on the spectrum. I never in a million years, that was not at all what I thought I'd be given a chance to do. So that's just been really powerful as well. Even in like the fashion industry, I'm speaking at a couple fashion companies in New York, and you know how retail stores and brick and mortar stores can be more adaptive when maybe a mom and a child are shopping and the child is touching a lot of the clothes.
The upside of this is beyond measure. So I think the upside is beyond measure, and where you can take this. It is interesting, and I think you're right about Gen Z. I'm really looking forward to seeing how Gen Alpha emerges.
Oh,
yes. I mean, you've got 3 Gen Alphas at home, and
I was born in 1983, so I'm actually that cuspy. They call it the Xennial generation, right? Like I can lean Gen X in some ways, but I am an older geriatric millennial, they call me. My oldest daughter will be the same for Gen Alpha. She'll be the youngest Gen Z / Gen Alpha.
Yeah. I met a young woman the other day, and I think she was, and I said to her, well, you're Gen Alpha, right? She said, no, I'm Gen Z.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
2000, I think it's 2012 begins Gen Alpha. My sister sent a photo to my family text about a photo of my niece who's 4, Gen Alpha. And she had taken my sister's, I wish I had my AirPods, and she had taken them and put them in with the pointy part in. And she said, this is how Gen Alpha pushes technology to its limits, right? Like she's trying to figure out how to spatially hear it differently than what we all, anticipate AirPods. The closer we look and accept the different, I love generational studies. I think it's fascinating.
It is. Well, I'm very grateful that you came on today. I'm really thankful to know you. I think you're a wonderful example of what is possible when we immerse ourselves in the diversity of human nature, whether we call it neurodiversity or whatever. And I think that's one of the things that will emerge over the next generation, is that we'll begin to respect the differences in people, not from an ideological point of view, but much more from a human point of view of how people just function differently, and we'll be able to see how to take those people and magnify their value to a company or to a community or whatever. I think that's what I see emerging in all of this.
Well, I thank you so much for having me. This is such a wonderful conversation. We could probably chat until 2025 about all of this.
I think so.
I love it. Thank you so much for having me. This was such a wonderful conversation, and being able to share my journey fills my heart and is such a wonderful way to keep the week going and moving on. So thank you. Thank
You're
you so
welcome.
much. And I look forward to, continuing this and our friendship as well.
I look forward to that too. And thank you all for watching. Please sign up and hit the like button and leave a question, because I'm sure that you know people that fit into this category and you want to be your best self with them so that your relationships will have an opportunity to bring something special to your life as well as to theirs. So ask your questions, make your comments, and we'll appreciate that. And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.